is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. This is actually quite nice for me to talk about this because this topic is very close to my heart for years now. And I am a clinician, so I'm also a computer scientist, but I present myself to you as a clinician today. And I can talk to you about building the bridge to the medical domain, to actually bridging the gap to the patients, to the doctors or nurses, and building trust in digital twins. First of all, I have a little, yeah, yeah. I have a little odd structure there. So I grouped it around four questions. So first of all, we will look at the landscape of the challenge to bridge to build trust in these artifacts. Then we will ask ourselves what models we are actually talking about. So I won't get into detail about the technical talks that you had already about methodology, but I'll ask myself more on a like, what is it that we pose to clinic? And then we will think about why we can't just put our models, our research models, into hospitals, into patient care. So this hopefully is a bit of an interesting question. And then last, even if I have the best model in the world, why don't they love my awesome model? So why don't they just all want to use it? So that's some considerations that I'll try to make there. So first of all, I advertised this talk with this infographic already. I did this for a paper a while ago for a medical audience, so this is quite simplified, and I'm aware of that. However, it kind of is a good way to approach the landscape if you want. So first of all, you have to think about the patient and physician reality that you approach. So they live up here. They know about disease states. They know to some degree about their data and the data they are generating, but it's basically a closed shop. And then you obviously have, and this is what most of you probably are familiar with, different kinds of modeling communities that try to simulate on an abstract level what disease states there are and try to inform the process that is up here. Um, both of these worlds come with distinct problems and distinct challenges in themselves. And like I understood this talk and the things that I should talk about is how do we bring these worlds together? Like how do we actually mold this together so it speaks to the data and in effect the patient reality so it can inform the meaningful outcomes that we are interested in medicine. And I'll come in the last bit of my talk, I'll also come to some considerations about multidisciplinarity in these teams, how to actually allow people to work together and get most beneficial outcomes in this task. So a bit more about myself. Like I said, I will function as a clinician today purely as I'm a specialist anesthetist at Mannheim University Hospital, part of Heidelberg University. And I am mostly occupied in my clinical reality with patients that are in quite distinct states that are going under general anesthesia, meaning being put to sleep to get operated on or having procedures that otherwise wouldn't be bearable. On the other hand, there is already in my daily work some technical abstraction, and this is also what led me to the whole field, which could be used for more intricate modeling approaches. Medicine in general, and I don't know whether that's so clear in this group, it's not a complete natural science. So you have a lot of social cultural aspects. You have a lot of art, as we say in German, associated with it. So not you might actually end up with the best predictions that you can think of, like dialing your AURC for your machine learning model, but it might not be as meaningful as you would wish it to be. On the other hand, medicine approaches disease states, so things that patients bring to us as their problems from a phenomenological understanding. So you look at the patient, you talk to patients, and you try to infer from a very superficial view what the disease process would be that is underlying. So this is the general approach that medicine has taken for hundreds of years. We have developed more intricate ways of measurement. So we now infer multimodal and time-resolved data. The time constants of the processor that we are looking at are ranging from hertz, like for example, 500 hertz for a diagnostic quality ECG, to observation points that lie sparse along several years of outcomes. So you look at, for example, how good is the survival over 1 year, over 5 years, over 10 years. And you wouldn't sample in between because that would be considered too much to ask for from specific patients. So this kind of has a intricacy about data handling. I wouldn't go into detail with that today, but this is something to be mindful of. And also, you have multiple processes. So if you, and Lise, who gave the first talk in the series, they always talk about this big vision of the digital twin, where you would expect a complete model, or the virtual human twin, as they call it, a complete model of the human physiology. But obviously, this has a lot of scale transition. So you come from a molecular level and you scale up to organ or body level simulations, for example, but also you can transcend into epidemiological research. And this is also something that you have to be mindful of, that this field is quite wide, and I'll come to that in a bit. On the other hand, you also talk about a different approach to medicine in general. So the whole digital twinning talk is also associated with the concept of personalized medicine, where you want to have an individualized prediction for one specific patient based on their data, which is fitted to a specific model. And this is also a process that we've seen in the last years, where we saw that our formerly very static approaches to generate evidence for good clinical practice is not reaching to a point where we can meaningfully inform these highly dynamic processes that I've just described. So you have processes that are multimodal, that have also multiple types of forcing, like medical treatment, basically, and you cannot standardize it in the degree where you would be able to do like a so-called randomized controlled trial and have good information for your treatment decisions. And this is something that we've learned, and there's even a paper that I've put down here where they ask, can we even in some fields, and this is specifically for me in intensive care medicine, can we even fathom continuing doing RCTs, like randomized controlled trials, in these contexts, because we saw that they are not very useful in guiding our practice as clinicians. So this is for the landscape. So this is the problem that I pose, and this is something to be mindful of. And next, I would like to think about, like, what are we actually talking about? Like, what are the models that are considered digital twins in a closer sense? So you already had two talks about different methods. So you had a talk about mechanistic models, and you had a talk about data-driven models, which is generally considered machine learning. And this is what Stefan Rulands also explained in his talk. And these are things that you should be mindful of, so I won't go into detail on these aspects. What I brought you today is 3 examples to open up this session. So first of all, I thought about, like, what would be, not in the application sense, but in the close to application sense, like where are examples for digital twinning studies where people actually used medical data, like patient data, and answered insightful and meaningful clinical questions that are close to the reality of the problems that we have at the bedside. And this is to inspire like how you would think about having these approaches and having these implementations of models transitioning into clinical care. So the first study I brought to you is from a group around Wolfgang Wall from Munich. He's looking into numerical modeling, FSI, for years now, and they have a very close look at pulmonary modeling, so lung physiology, like how people breathe on a organ level, like microstructural. So you see up here that you have these little branches, and this is how the lung looks like if you look at it closer. And they managed to devise a mechanistic model that you can ventilate. So this is something that is very useful if you think about how do we normally approach ventilation in intensive care medicine, for example, with people that have problems breathing by themselves, so we have to breathe for them. They came up with an approach where they used the CT of said patient. They adapted their mechanistic model to that CT image and tried to outline the architecture of these lungs, and then try to ventilate these artificial lungs and try to predict another entity that you can measure without going through the hassle of getting people into a CT scanner, which is a big machine, and you have to transport them there. So this is a big process. So you would rather have them wear a belt, which is called EIT, electrical impedance tomography. And this belt can give you these little images where you can see where is the lung more distended, less distended. Do I ventilate these people well, or do I over-ventilate? Do I actually harm the lung? So this is a very feasible and closely knit question from clinical reality. The next study I brought to you is from the people around Blanca Rodriguez. I probably could have used a study from Axel, who's also hosting this series, but I worked up this study before, so I just left it in there. What they did is they approached a problem which you have when you have people with heart failure coming into hospital. So these people have a chronic condition with their heart. It's quite dangerous. They are in high risk of dying spontaneously when they get worse. And you normally don't get to perform a so-called magnetic resonance imaging, so MRI, on each and every one of those patients. So you cannot really know which patient has a worsening of their heart failure. You have to guess by phenomena. So that's what I said before. We are approaching the patient by symptoms of their disease. And what they did is they used MRIs from patients with heart failure, and they adapted their microstructural electrophysiology model of the heart to these MRIs. And they then derived ECGs, surface ECGs, that you can easily measure in, for example, A&E, like in the emergency department, and try to inform what specific changes would occur in a changed heart in these specific patients. So you could then eventually, hopefully, and this is a research study, obviously this is all pre-translation, but you could eventually infer by a 12-lead ECG, which is non-invasive, it doesn't harm the patient, whether they had a worsening in their heart failure. So that's also quite a nice idea. And the last example I brought to you is something, and this is something I'll pick up later as well. It's about informing clinical interventions, like actually trying to use computational modeling, like digital twinning, for preventing people from taking harm or preventing people from having to undergo specific procedures they won't profit from. So this is a condition where a specific part of the heart is beating in chaotic fashion, so it's called atrial fibrillation. And we know that in specific bits of the heart, there is clots that form quite easily, and these clots, like these blood clots, can fly off by the beating heart quite easily and clog up arteries and cause stroke and organ infarction and lung infarction and all these things. So that's not something that you want for your patient. So what they did is they looked at CT images and ultrasounds from the heart, and they looked at a specific procedure where you put a little plug into that bit of the heart where the clots normally form. The problem with these plugs is that they always, sometimes they also make blood clots form more easily. So you might actually give that patient that intervention, but they might actually not profit from it, but be worse off because they might even have more clot formation because of that little plug. That's called an occluder if you're interested. And they did computational fluid mechanics on these specific anatomies of the heart and tried to predict which geometry of these occluders would be high risk or low risk for clot formation. So you wouldn't put somebody with a specific device if they had a worse outcome afterwards. So that would be eventually informing better treatment. And like I said before, like Torsten, you said before, if there is questions in between, please ask. I'd rather have that. So, as I said before, we are talking about different varieties of models. And this is a bit of a challenge because there is quite a vast field of different numerical models that are used depending on the problem that is answered. So I showed you a lot of highly parametric like PDA models that people use to answer specific questions around highly time resolved problems. But there's also a large modeling community looking at more reduced order models like 0D, almost like bond graph or RC element models that are more like simplistic representations of global organ functions, for example. Or if you look into epidemiological studies, or for example, what Lisa's group does in Leuven, they look at agent-based systems for bone healing or bone metabolism. So there is a bit of a mixed bag on the numerical models field side. So you have to be aware of that, and this is also deciding what problems you can answer feasibly. But also you have to consider that there is a lot of machine learning methods that are put forward recently, and I'll come to that later, that are also ordering on this numerical approach and this first principle approach that we are mainly talking about when we talk about digital twins. One recent example that I've gave in a past talk in Helmholtz here is for a conjunction between these modeling schools or modeling philosophies, AlphaFold 2, which uses machine learning, but also strictly first principle physics-inspired modeling paradigms for reaching better results. So that is something that I, for example, find quite interesting. One of the main challenges that I see on this side of the graph or the infographic is actually combining the phenomena or the purely technical considerations around modeling in these fields with the conceptual realm that is completely independently articulated in the medical field. So this is a huge challenge in harmonization that will need to come to place to actually be able to talk to each other between the medical field and the modeling field. And as I said, In medicine, on the other hand, you are mainly guided by patients' problems. Like patients come to you with their symptoms, or they are informed about their symptoms, and they, to some degree, understand that they generate data, but that data, if it's generated, is not always stored in a systematic fashion. So, as most of these methods are very data heavy, you would want to have a broad data collection to base this modeling, this model fitting on. We have implementation of so-called digital twins, if you want, in clinical medicine. So, for example, for years now, we have so-called PK/PD models, which is pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic models for drug action in patients, and we can guide specific treatments with drugs for these patients based on large cohorts that we measured. How will a drug correspond to like a dose of drug to a specific level that is then treating a certain disease? And this is something that also somebody from the group of Michaela van der Schaar from Cambridge did a couple of years ago in the COVID pandemic. They looked at new models of this kind that can easily be derived from clinical data in the scientific field. But here as well, we have huge challenges, and I'll come to that as well at a later point. But let's focus on the question that I put up here, like why can't we just deploy our models into hospital and see how it goes? Like try to get these models at the bedside and then co-create and co-develop these scientific models with the clinicians. And I sometimes find, and I worked with engineers and computer scientists for quite a while now, I sometimes find it's mostly the struggle to understand that even if you have your data that you store for these highly parametric models, and numerical models are highly parametric in most ways, you don't necessarily have all the data that you require for fitting. So I brought you a little example, like what would be if you, for example, wanted to have a specific measurement to fit your model. So let's say you have all your data harmonized and you have a good collaboration with your clinicians, and they are willing to do everything for you so you can fit your model to the most optimal set of data. So you say, okay, I have this mechanistic cardiac model. I find this very interesting. I think we can have huge benefits from it, but we need to fit this to a specific patient, we need the direct measurement of the pressure that is in the left ventricle of the heart. So this is the main chamber of the heart. It pumps the blood around the body. This is what you feel when you feel your artery at your wrist. So this is something you can request. So what would it need for that clinician to actually give you that measurement? And this is something to be mindful of. So first of all, you would need the patient to lie down. You would have to have like a setting where you can find the way to the heart. I boiled it down to the relevant structures that you would be mindful of. And I give you a very short walkthrough of what we do if we want to make that measurement. So you have the patient who's now just the heart. This is the aortic arch, which is the main big blood vessel. You don't cut into that, that's not good. And then you have the big arteries coming here, and one of these big arteries going to your left arm. Patients always, like the image is always flipped. So this artery runs down your arm, and then you have it here. I obviously removed something here, so that's not how it normally looks. And then if you wanted to get access to your left ventricle, you would need to put a needle in there. So this is something you can practice. You can do that. I can do that. Many people in interventional radiology are far better than me, or cardiology. So you stick a needle in there, there's some bleeding, you should be rather quick about it so the patient doesn't bleed. And then you have to feed a wire through that needle into the artery. So you end up somewhere here. So you have to find your way around kinks and corners of these arteries. And eventually you'll end up in this left ventricle where you can measure the pressure that you required before. This takes about, depending on the skill of the people, if you just wanted to do that, around about half an hour, and it needs a lot of specialist personnel to perform this measurement. And this is something to be aware of if you think about like what measures do I need from the bedside, from the patients to fit your model. So this is obviously a very specific example and a very harsh example, but we have a lot of data in hospitals already, as I said. But I would invite you to think about it like the talk by Nicole Young, but 100 times worse. So we are not looking after our own lab books, and we are not in charge of all the kit that we are operating, but we are in a complex network with professionals that maintain our infrastructure for us. And we have a lot of vendors that care for each and every of these data silos. So you have radiology information systems, medication information systems. You have the documentation part, which is generally called EHR, electronic health records. You have the monitoring domain, which is, if it's stored at all, it's mostly stored in very unfair data types and so forth. And each and every manufacturer at this point produces that data, if you even can get them to give you that data as a clinician, in a very proprietary standard that you have to write interfaces for. And this is a problem that each and every hospital has to solve over and over again. And we are far, far removed from this realm where you can just basically pull the data from the bedside. So this is something that I was working on for like a couple of years, and I can tell you we are far from done there. There are, however, some initiatives, and I said before, like the harmonization between the standardization in numerical modeling and the harmonization standardization in medicine can go hand in hand. So I know that people that work in here are also very much involved in the harmonization in the medical field. But this is something that you, by complying, by actually investing in these joint projects, this one is by Amble EBI. These are people, many of these people are within NFDI for health in this case, but we heard about NFDI for chem before. And many of these initiatives are also supported by your universities. So it's useful to think about the boring data structure aspect, because by producing models that speak these languages and are translatable into each other, you can actually further the field where you generate data down the line and make more, like prove that this is very useful for a patient in the long run. So it's a love service to your successes if you want. So if you wanted, let's say you are a person that has all the best interests. You want to basically standardize all your patient data that you can collect and that you can get your hands on and eventually do mechanistic modeling with it. And you end up at a fairly large German hospital, very research heavy, traditionally very good with acquiring money. And they happen to build a new hospital. So completely clean slate, new building, all technology that is built into the shop, like into the operating room, to the wards, is all streamlined so it can be used to large scale data integration. you might be successful, and I mean that's what we managed. So, for example, between February 22 and October 24, that was some let's say uh, some line we drew, and we looked at where did we go. We collected 35 terabyte of uncompressed raw signals from the monitoring in this hospital from 18,000 patients. So for each and every patient that went through there, we were able to collect the data, and we also were able to collect many other aspects of this multimodal data and store it in the research data warehouse that is common to the whole university hospital. However, we had at the beginning of this project, we had an initial funding on top of everything else of 2 million. And with this, we devised a clinical study which was needed to actually make it possible to that people would comply and get on board, because it's publication relevant and it's ethically sound to perform this in this context. And we also had like a registry aspect where you can argue in front of your ethics committee that it's ethical to store this data of these patients for a further use. And we also had funding for infrastructure components apart from these 2 millions. We were able to perform a general development. So this was strategic interest for our hospital. We were able to actually compensate all involved specialties for the work that they've put in, like work time wise. And it still needed, alone for this biosignaling aspect, 2 years of a multidisciplinary tag team work where we met many, many times to get the signals in a format into the research data warehouse where it's usable. However, there was continuous discussion about key infrastructure components. So you were fighting about a terabyte of storage within this hospital research infrastructure. We waited 4 years until a specific component of that data that is collected about these patients was delivered finally. So this only worked out, I think, 2 years ago or 1.5 years ago, that we actually had access to the data, which was not a technical problem, to be fair. And this is the most important thing. I showed you all these pictures of different standards and different standardization communities, but many of the data aspects that we deal with in hospitals do not have sound international standards that you can work towards. So we are still in the process where people fight over which standard to use, but they don't really think about what is the most feasible standard, which is something you might be surprised if you come from a technical field, because this is something that is inherent to medicine, that there's a lot of disjunct and non-collaborative philosophy around medical data. Data sharing is something that is quite hard to broker. So this is one aspect, but also, like I said before, you don't necessarily have the resources to perform your modeling in the research hospital, even in research hospitals, but let alone in other hospitals. So getting significant compute resources in a hospital data center, or even having more than 1 terabyte of storage for a specific project, is non-trivial, because medical hardware, if it is run in medical data centers, is highly overpriced because it's medical grade, and normally hospitals don't have the resources to just build their big research infrastructure by themselves. So this needs more collaborative approaches between hospitals and the research institutions that are used to work with high performance computing clusters and run models on multiple GPU cores or hundreds of CPU cores. Because if you want to run something in a hospital, you would rather think about dialing down your model and having using like reduced order models, because you have to cope with the restraint in infrastructure that you have. There is good examples for these joint collaborative efforts of healthcare systems. So, for example, if you look at the NHS, which is not in Germany, not normally known as something very progressive and providing good care in a way, but actually they are quite far ahead concerning their research infrastructure, where they set up, and this was 2018, I think they started already, a centralized, very secure data hub for, first it was all of London, and then it was many other trusts across the country in which is governed by something that's called NHS Digital, and you have different research institutions that just basically can plug into that research infrastructure and also use central hardware infrastructure and perform high performance computing and don't worry about storage in these environments. So this is why I want to come to this concept of pipelines. Like, this is something that has to be jointly done between the modelers and the hospital IT or data people, if you like, because you cannot consider having like a one-off solution that you came up with within your research environment, then deploy it to the hospital and expect it to work. But it's rather an iterative process that needs to be done within hospital to actually also have an information on how does this correspond to actual treatment? Like, how do we evolve with our digital twinning endeavors? And I'll come to the regulatory aspect in a very brief way later on. I'll keep it quick. But first of all, I wanted to show something. If you consider not staying in research, not saying, okay, I want to deploy my research model into hospital, but rather you want to go into marketization, you want to do, how do you call it, technology transfer into the medical field. So you want to provide something that people can buy and implement in their clinical care. I brought you an example. I don't have stock in this company. I don't have stock in any companies that you might recognize in this talk. But I found it quite interesting because this was the first computational modeling approach that made it to something that's called software as a medical device in the US. So they had FDA approval. It was in 2022. They're called HeartFlow, and what they do is they look at, and you saw that approach before, they look at the imaging of a patient, in this case, the heart. It's a specific CT image of the heart, like computed tomography, like X-ray going around. And you can basically look at the so-called coronary arteries, like the vessels that feed the heart and that clog up if you have a heart attack. That's what they do. And they combine that with a physiological model. Mostly these are 1D or 0D models. That mostly it's 1D because you want to model vasculature. They obviously don't disclose their model, but they want to model how will the heart perform if it is stressed. So if it beats faster and blood flow changes in heart vessels that are narrow, that are almost clogged up, how does the patient get blood to specific areas in their heart? So it's a very feasible question because this is something that you normally have to stress the patient for. So you have to basically make their heart beat faster, and this is dangerous in somebody that is at risk of heart attack. So they also have devised a very specific source of data. So they have the good situation that DICOM data, which is the radiological standard for CTs of any kind internationally, it is very available in hospitals. So they can just plug in there and don't have to think about how to standardize the data that they're using for their modeling. Over the years, they performed several clinical studies with hundreds of patients. So they actually looked at how does this improve the clinical care? Like, how does that correlate to meaningful endpoints for these patients that we are looking at. And they showed reliable prediction. And this is something that obviously is very important in the context if we talk about digital twinning and mechanistic modeling, because all these machine learning, like the black box modeling approaches, struggle with this. And we'll come to that later, like reliability and explainability in prediction and uncertainty quantification in all areas of the initial distribution. So if you had the idea to develop a digital twin and that should be a medical device, in Europe, you would have to think about specific regulations. And I only brought two. And this is, for once, the medical device regulation. So if you want to set up something as a medical device, and be mindful, this has to be done before actually starting development. So if you had a prototype, you can chuck it and you have to start anew to actually develop something for the medical market. You have to have a risk management system in place. You have to do clinical evaluation as they did. You have to do you have to do technical documentation, which you have to update, and you must keep for at least 10 years. You have to be conforming with certain international norms or standards. The identifier is normally not a problem. And you also have to have a quality management system on top of the risk management system to class your device according to the risk class. And obviously we are in medical, so that's normally, depending on what you want to predict, quite high. You do need to do post-market surveillance, so you have to be careful, like what happens after you put your product to the market. You have to provide the documentation in languages of all countries that your product is used in. So in the EU, that's quite a lot of products, especially if you would want to do you want to provide it for the whole EU. And obviously, you have to be able to recall products that are harmful to patients. So this is only the MDR. And obviously, you're also dealing with the EU AI Act now, which is something that we still have to see how the courts read into it, like what the actual jurisdiction on it will be. But from the text itself, you see that the AI systems and numerical modeling or digital twins are also AI systems according to this regulation. They are in medicine and they are almost automatically high risk. So you end up in that bracket. So you see your risk management again, but here you also see the requirements on data governance. So you have to prove what data you use to come to a certain model. Obviously, documentation. You have to be traceable with your model development. So you have to basically document, like the talk about the lab books, you have to document everything up to the point where you deployed your model to the hospital. The explainability part, as I said. So this is a benefit for this modeling community because explainability is quite easily achieved with numerical models. You have to have human oversight, so no level 5 systems. And then you have also post-market monitoring, all these aspects of liability that are normal for medical products, but also you have some regulations that are more guided towards open standards and collaboration. So you have to basically be open to collaboration and be providing your data. If it comes out of your model, all these conceptions are put into that regulation on the EU level. And we'll see, like I said, how that plays out over the next couple of years. So this is the last bit of my talk. So why don't they all love my awesome model? So you develop a wonderful model that speaks to patients, that tries to solve specific questions. And it might still be that the medical field or patients do not adopt your model. And this is something to be aware of, that the medical community in itself is only allowed to do whatever good for the patient. And we already went through a very important development over the last years where it's moved away from that directive, like the patient asks the doctor what they think is best for them. Doctors know best. All these old and very unproblematic approaches to medicine, more towards this what we called informed consent. So patients can expect to be informed to the degree where they can make decisions as individuals for themselves and be empowered in their treatment decisions. And we as doctors have a specific role where we have to somehow broker specific technological developments, which were there were a lot of technological developments over the last 50 years, and many of those didn't help us a lot in our clinical practice. So we have to gain an understanding of what is it that we are trying that is trying to be sold to us or is offered to us, and does it really benefit my patients? And we have to convince patients, especially if it's more clinical and it's more interventional, what we do, that this device is safe and they should use it. So they want to be consulted and they want to be able to know if they ask for it. So if you then consider what happened in the machine learning community, and this is only one example by the group around Mariam Gassemi from MIT. I don't know, I think she moved now, but I followed her work because she's very much very deep in the ethics on medical AI. And this slide is more like how not to build trust. So this is a discussion that has been going on for quite a while in the States now. And this study from 2021 looked at state-of-the-art AI classification tools for X-rays. Like chest X-rays, something that is done quite often in the medical field, where you look at the lungs, not in a CT image, not in the big scanner, but in a very simple radiograph of your lung. And there is tools that can detect lung cancer and pneumonia and all types of different medical conditions, and they normally have wonderful receiver operating curves. But if you then look at the specific subgroups they had underrepresented in the development, you see that they perform way less in underrepresented groups, like, for example, children or ethnic minorities. So this might be a bit confusing, but in this case, they plotted it like no finding is the false positive rate or false negative rate in this study. So if you look at this study later on, be mindful that the higher the bar is, the worse it is for the people, and especially for children. I found that very interesting, that you are at chance level here. So this is the false positive rate. So in 50% of the cases, the prediction is false, and it predicts that there is no finding, meaning that it misses a specific condition in this group of patients. So this is obviously something that also made the press for machine learning, and this is something that hopefully our community is able to improve on, to make better contributions, to be more on point with their clinical studies. And this is something I stumbled across in preparation of this talk. I want to invite you to look at this if you are working in, especially in the borderline field between mechanistic modeling and machine learning. Nature Digital Medicine put out a specific collection, which is the deadline is in February next year, and they're looking at our specific goals of combining the black box tools of machine learning which they are, with numerical physics-inspired or physics-informed modeling. So if you're interested in that, have a look at it. It's on their website. I myself was quite impressed last year at a conference by a PhD student from Erlangen, and they looked at a problem which I know from hospital quite well. So the problem is centering around cerebral ischemia, so stroke, ischemic stroke, so not enough blood coming to the brain, and meaning that people have like palsy and lose their speech and potentially have bad outcomes neurologically. So what we normally do is we try to prevent these things. So you also have some conditions where you can anticipate this from happening. So normally people would get in this machine, they would get a so-called cerebral angiography, which means the same as before. When you want to go to the heart, to the left ventricle, you can also go to the brain through the artery. So it's a bit more complicated to get there. So you fiddle your way up there into the brain vessels, and you try to image what the occlusion in specific brain vessels there is. However, as I said before, only doing like the measurement of the left ventricle, which is fairly simple to get there, would require you at least half an hour procedure time. With this, you normally spend 5 hours, 3 to 5 hours in the intervention room. Patients normally have to go under general anesthesia. That's why I'm there. And it's obviously not something you want to put people under if it's not necessary. So is there a way of pre-intervention testing of some of the questions that we have considering this intervention, this invasive intervention? And what they did is they basically simulated that machine that I've just showed you and simulated rotational images. So the vessels, this here, these wiggly bits, that's the vessels of the brain. They simulated X-raying them like the machine does, and they performed CFD, so computational fluid dynamics, in 1 dimension plus time, where they looked at how does the contrast agent, so the medication that shows how the artery is perfused, how the blood flows through it, they simulated that in these vascular trees. And they then used this data set to basically inform a convolutional neural network to predict the flow on real world, like real patient vascular trees. And by that, they actually achieved quite good error statistics on predicting the flow through these complicated arterial structures without performing the needle puncture. Obviously, in this case, this was it had to be done because you needed to have the control in the patients, but of how the blood flows. However, eventually, you probably can see that this will translate into performing computational fluid dynamics based on CT images already, or having just an X-ray, a rotational X-ray taken from patients without sticking a needle into them, and ruling out, for example, cases where there's very little likelihood that this is a problem with their vasculature, where they would have to go under this 3 hours intervention otherwise. And this, why I choose this is because this use case is obviously it's about combining machine learning with numerical modeling, but also there's also a specific clinical question that is centered around harm reduction. Like, do we really need to stick a needle into that patient? Do we really need to give them contrast agents which are toxic to the kidneys? And it's performed with scientific rigor. But also, and this is quite interesting, also here I don't have any stock in them, but they have corporate backing. So this is a private-public partnership. So there is very high likelihood that this will translate into a medical device because you have a very proficient stakeholder invested in this that can translate it into a real-world clinical application. And this is the interesting bit because you can solve very high stakes problems with these methods, and this is being shown in many points. And in my last couple of minutes, I will come to the very thing that is very close to my heart. I said already that we went through a refurbishment of how we think about how we should treat our patients. So this is patient-centered medical research, and this is a recommendation to be mindful of that if you perform also machine learning studies or any studies that are directed at clinical realities. We have learned that we should focus on outcomes that are meaningful for patients. We are good at, in medicine, we are good at looking at endpoints that are death or length of stay because hospitals are interested that it's cost efficient for them to treat the patients. But these are all not things that are normally very deep within our work ethics as clinicians. So thankfully, over the last couple of years, we started collecting patient-reported outcomes and patient-important outcomes and rethought, like, what do we actually care for? And you have, for example, things like quality of adjusted life years as a measurement, like measuring how good is the life for a specific collective of patients. We have well-being scales, and we measure frailty, like how frail are elderly people or how disabled are people after our treatments, even if they survived. So this is an integration into research that is done right now. And also I give you an example from my field, my medical field, because that's what I know best about. And this was a study that was presented to us last year. It was quite well published. So New England Journal of Medicine is quite good. And it's a long-standing debate. Stress ulcer prophylaxis, so bleeding, like people get ulcers here in the stomach if they are in intensive care because they're stressed. It's not a nice place, and people get lots of treatment that make them prone for ulcers and bleeding eventually, and that might actually harm them. But we don't know whether it's better for them or worse if we give them pantoprazole, the stuff that you can take if you have a bad heartburn. So quite a large study for intensive care. Normally you have like a couple of hundred at tops. They almost got 5,000 patients from multiple centers, and they did standard placebo-controlled randomized controlled trial. But what was interesting is, and they explained that in depth, and if you're interested, the paper, the citation is down there as well. They did two sets of endpoints. One was the classical clinical endpoint, and one was a patient and family-centered endpoint. So they actually sat down with patients and families and asked them, what is important for you? Like, what should we look for in the sense of clinical treatment trajectories? Like, what is traumatic or unpleasant for you? And what came of it is that the clinical endpoints didn't show any difference. So as was before, not something that is reportable because we know that we can or cannot do it. There's indecisive evidence for these strategies. But if you consider what is important to patients, you should actually treat these patients because all the things that they found most stressful compounded to a good evidence for treatment. And this was something that was very interesting to me. So how do you go about it? There's lots of different patient initiatives and patient representatives. There is EU-wide networks and forums where you can contact people and ask them to get on board with your research grant. And actually, there's even education for patients by a specific academy that is run by the EU. And you can actually get them on early and try to improve your research questions so it's tailored to meaningful outcomes, and they can help you with that. It's also progressively integrated in medical research grants. So you are expected to have patient public involvement and patient-centered study designs. So that's also a reason why you should do it, apart from the humane reason. Unfortunately, for the digital twin, I cannot give you a great review that was done, but I can give you one systematic review that was published last year. They had kind of a mixed bag of methods, so it was all studies that flagged up with digital twin for medical application. So they filtered for purely technical papers. They didn't include that. So their minimum criteria was that it was a medical intervention with a digital twin, and they wanted to have measurement of clinical outcome after intervention. They went from 1,300 studies to 12. So they only analyzed 12 studies because all the other studies didn't meet these very, very basic inclusion criteria. And of these 12 studies, most of them didn't even have a control group, which is something that you would expect in good scientific practice. So it's a lot of preliminary work in this field, so that you can really get good scientific impact if you devise your scientific study together with clinicians and center around health benefits. And this is basically what the last thing I wanted to say. So I'll sum up the key points that I made or tried to make to you. It's an active field of research, so it's only starting off right now. The variety in modeling paradigms is daunting, so you have to be clear, like, what are you actually looking into? But there is very promising approaches, especially at the borderline field between machine learning and numerical modeling. But it needs to be harmonized internally to be able to talk about the same semantic concepts within the field, and there is initiatives for that, but also trans-domain, because otherwise you won't be reaching the endpoints that you want to inform. On the other hand, we have a multimodal mess in medicine. It's noisy, it's poorly annotated, and it's kept in silos. So this is a mammoth task that will occupy us over the next couple of years, and I'm part of that. However, we are on the road, and I think joint development will make it better, especially if you can prove that data collection in the clinical environment makes for good scientific results that help patients. That's the main thing that you have to argue with. But even if you collect all the data, not every measurement that you can perform is ethically sound. I can give you examples for what people did in the past if you are interested. And in the end, it's a collaborative task. So get involved with clinicians, with clinical environments, and collaborate on devising better studies, and not try to abstract to a degree where it's no longer clinically useful to the people that should use it at some point. Regulatory compliance is daunting. So personally, and this is something I always try to stay away from medical device regulation classed medical studies. So you can devise it in a way that it is not for patient use, and you still can test and prototype in medical environments, but you have to be clear that it is not used at the bedside, and mind patient importance, because that's what we are all here for. And that's how I want to close. I thank you, and I'm open to questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris.